Welcome to our first lecture on one of the market structures we'll be studying. So a market structure, as we'll see, it's just a way that we define how, how an industry is organized, right? How many firms, how many consumers are in an industry. The first one we look at is competitive markets. Competitive markets, it gives us a baseline to look at why is competition so desirable. We look at competitive markets first, but there are three other market structures that we'll be studying in this course. Monopoly, which is the other extreme, right? Perfect competition, as we're going to see, it's really kind of an extreme market structure. Monopoly is the opposite extreme. Oligopoly and monopolistic competition are the other two. Those are more in-between market structures, right? So not perfectly competitive, but not a monopoly. Perfect competition, in order for a market to be perfectly competitive, we need to see a large number of small firms, product that is identical or homogeneous, easy entry and exit into or out of the market, and perfect information, specifically to do with pricing. Right? Everybody knows everybody else's prices. So a large number of small firms, what do we mean by that? Well, we don't have a set number, but nobody knows exactly what number this is. Is it 6? Is it 8? Is it 12? Is it 14? I don't think anybody's really sure. But you do need enough that each firm is small relative to the total market size, right? Specifically, you need enough that if each firm decides to raise or lower their output dramatically, they don't have enough, they're not big enough where they affect the price, right? There's so many other firms that one firm won't affect the price, just like we kind of assume that one consumer is not going to be enough to affect the market price in any given market. Product is identical. Well, this is a big one with perfectly competitive markets, right? The product's exactly the same, which rules out pricing differences, right? You can't price an identical product differently. It also rules out advertising differences. Nobody's going to advertise, hey, come buy our corn because it tastes just like everybody else's, right? It would never happen. Because the product's identical, buyers are indifferent about whom to buy the product from. Easy entry and exit into the market. So a new firm must face no barriers, or at least extraordinarily low barriers to entering the market. The barriers to entering on a market: financial, technical, or government imposed. So barriers. I mean, if it costs a lot of money to start a business, that's a barrier in and of itself, right? It can make it more difficult to set up a business. So to get into a perfectly competitive market, it can't be that expensive to jump into it. Technical barriers, right? There's the expertise that might be needed to run a specific business. In some businesses, some internet-type businesses, there's not really much of a financial barrier, not much of a government-imposed barrier, but there is a technical barrier, right? You have to be skilled enough to know what you're doing to start the business. Government imposed, governments do impose a lot of barriers. Right? If you wanted to, let's say that you thought, you know what, I'd like to start cutting people's hair, and you just do, right? You set up, you open up a room in your house and start cutting people's hair. You are breaking the law, right? Because you don't have a license. To get the license is extremely costly. That's a huge barrier to entry, right? You're breaking the law. If you try to cut people's hair and you keep doing it, eventually you will get thrown in prison for cutting someone's hair. That is a barrier to entry. Government has all sorts of other barriers to entry, which we will cover as we move along. Perfect information. Firm and each consumer knows others' products and prices. The big thing, if somebody decides to lower their price, or if somebody's offering it for a lower price, everybody knows. Before we say what will a competitive market look like in the short run, I want you to think about what markets might be perfectly competitive. Maybe even pause it for a minute and try to write down whatever markets you think might be perfectly competitive. Well, I hope you've come up with a list now. I hope you paused it, have a list of markets that might be perfectly competitive. Some common examples, one that I might get are, say, gas stations. So that's one that students often will mention, but gas stations don't quite fit the bill because a couple things. One, gas stations do often market that their gasoline is better than other gasoline. And I have no idea whether that's actually true or not, but as long as some consumers believe it, then the product is different, right? The difference in the product doesn't even have to be real. It just has to be perceived as different, and it could matter. Gas stations also, the services and amenities they provide. Some of the local gas stations around here, like Sheetz, try to market how great their food is and their coffee is so that you'll want to stop at Sheetz on your way to work. Others, other gas stations, right, can compete because of their location. Especially if you're on a trip and you drive off, if you're off of the interstate and you stop, and the gas station that's right off the interstate is a lot more appealing usually than one that's a mile and a half away. So location matters, and you can price differently if you're right next to the interstate than if you're a mile and a half away. So gas stations don't quite fit the bill. Some people sometimes think restaurants, but restaurants serve different food. It's certainly not an identical product. Agricultural commodities, well, now the product's identical, right? Grain or whatever. However, usually it's not a lot of small firms there. It's usually bigger firms that might have some market power, but you might have might be some leeway there where if you have some industry where there's a whole lot, maybe agricultural commodities. Maybe the one that I think might come closest is, say, like hot dog stands. You know, if you have a festival where you have like 30 vendors coming up, 30 hot dog stand vendors. Unless there's some quality that you know about ahead of time, really, the product's going to seem pretty identical to everybody beforehand. Because of that, and it's pretty close to perfectly competitive. But I think it's tough. There are very few markets that really match this definition of perfectly competitive very well. Which, of course, then you might be saying, well, why in the world are we studying this? Studying this gives a really good idea of the baseline of what would the ideal world look like of perfectly competitive markets. The next section, when we cover monopoly, there's really not many sections that are markets that would look exactly like a monopoly either. And usually it's because there are some substitutes for products. So we do the same in monopoly to look at the ill effects of only having one firm in the market, similar to why total and complete competition is so great. Okay, back onto the topic. What does a perfectly competitive market look like in the short run? Well, the firm is what we call a price taker. And if we go back to our conditions, we'll see why, right? The firms they're all small, so they don't have power over the price, and they're selling an identical product. If other firms can jump into and out of the market, so the firms actually will have no control over the price that they charge, what we call a price taker. So the firm's demand curve is horizontal, right? They can sell as much as they want at the price, at the market price. But because they're so small, even if they sell a lot or a little, it's not going to alter the market price, any one firm's decision. So each firm has no control over the price of the product it sells. So the firm's demand curve is horizontal, something like this, right? In this particular case, this firm could sell as much as it wants at the price of $2.50. But we ask, is the market demand curve horizontal? And that answer is no. This would be an example of the industry or the market, right? Here you'd have lots of firms and lots of consumers, and that helps set the equilibrium price. The price that's set in the market comes over, and that gives you the horizontal flat demand curve that we see with one particular firm. So the firm faces a constant price, Its only decision, which makes your life in a way a little bit easier in this section, is how much to produce. Price is always the same. So how much to produce to maximize profits, right? Remember our goal for the firm, we laid out that assumption explicitly recently that the firm wants to maximize profits. So it has to figure out what output to produce to maximize profits. Well, in a way this makes your decision easier because the price they're facing is always the same. So what happens if the firm charges more or less than the market price? Like, this is asking the question, are we wrong, right? We're saying that the firm has this one price. Are we wrong? Well, what would happen if the firm decides to charge more? Let's go back to this specific graph. If the firm tried to charge $2.75, what would happen? Well, given that we know that consumers are well informed, if the firm tried to charge $2.75, it might be selling 8, 9, or 10 units at $2.50. If it tries to sell it for $2.60, just a little bit higher, it now will sell nothing. It will go from selling as many units as it wants to sell to having a quantity demanded of 0 based on the price they're trying to charge. So the firm's demand curve, if they try to charge any more than the market price, they'll sell nothing. So once again, the decision's on the price. But you might be asking, well, what about a lower price, right? Take a moment and pause and try to justify why they would never want to charge a lower price, which they wouldn't. They don't want to ever charge a lower price. Take a moment, pause it, and try to figure out why. Okay, I hope you paused it. So a lower price. Why would the firm never want to charge a lower price? Well, the reason goes back to this flat demand curve and the explanation that we've had. The firm can sell as much or as little as it wants at the market price. So it could sell 50 units at the market price. Sell 100. It could sell however many it wants at the market price. Why would it possibly want to sell as many as it wants at a lower price? Right? The lower price does no good. It can already sell as many as it needs to sell or as it wants to sell for the market price. If it lowers it, all they're doing is getting a lower price per unit. Right? If you have 10, let's say you have a hot dog stand and you could sell, people are just always lined up as long as you don't raise it above $2.50. You have as much demand as you want. Well, if you decide to lower the price to $2.45, are you going to be able to sell more? No, because people are just lined up to buy them at $2.50. So the firm can produce as much or as little as it wants at the market price. If it lowers it, it's still going to sell as much. It just will make fewer, a smaller profit per unit by doing that. So the firm's decision here is solely to produce the output, figure out what output will maximize profits. We are going to look at 2 different methods the firm could use to determine the optimal production level, right? The right level of output. First is the total revenue minus total cost method. The second is the marginal revenue equals marginal cost method. So either of these methods could be used. The second one's certainly much more elegant or refined of a method. The total revenue minus total cost method's a bit more clunky, especially if you would choose to move up in your economics education beyond the principles level. But we do study the total revenue minus total cost method first, and these methods should give you the identical answer. Right? When you go through this, both of these methods should give you the identical answer.